I think there was a constant fear. We weren't really conscious of it. Growing up, there was a real chaos and tension.
You wanted to become in the army. What did that actually look like?
Had to lie, tell lies about what you're doing.
Do you feel the weight of those decisions in the moment?
Really care for your soldiers, but sometimes have to make decisions which individually are not.
What does that actually look like in practice?
Everything is about succeeding on that mission. Doesn't mean things don't go wrong.
Jill, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure, Lewis. Good to see you.
You're busy in the world of education again just now in the British Army. How's that looking?
Yes, I'm effectively a student this year again, which is great at my age and stage. I'm very lucky to be on the Global Strategy Programme, which is at the Royal College of Defence Studies in London. Not sure I was 100% sure what I was going to when I applied, but it's a course, I'm technically a student at King's College London, but a real privilege to have the opportunity to work with international colleagues. There's 112 people on the course from 45 different nations, both military and civilian and industry in the UK, because I think most of the world is realising that defence is not just for people in uniform. And so a real privilege to be learning from some really clever and accomplished people.
Great. Listen, thank you so much for joining me today. There's a lot I want to pick your brains on, particularly for the course you're doing just now. I think never before has just the world of our civilians been so aware of what's going on in terms of global threat, defence and things like that. But I know from previous conversations we've had, you've got an amazing story and you've worked your way through the different ranks of the army. So there'll be a lot of different things I'd love to touch upon today. I'd love to start with maybe a difficult question for you. How do you define great leadership?
I suppose one of the problems of coming through an organisation that thinks so much about leadership is quite often you do learn or at least get exposed to definitions. So I have thought about this a lot. I think leadership is you only need leadership if you've got to go somewhere. It's an A to B. So I think leadership is about motivating a group of people, usually. We could say there's self-leadership, but a group of people to do something, to do a task, and to do more than they would have done without that leadership. I think leadership is the bit that brings out the discretionary effort from people.
Yeah.
And you know, to a common purpose, I guess is the binding principle.
Really good. Love that. And your rank in the army is Brigadier. Can you tell us a little bit more on what Brigadier is and what does that mean from a ranking perspective?
It's I'm a reservist, so I was in the regular army. When I was a young junior officer, I thought brigadiers were very, very senior. But of course, as you go up, there's always somebody more senior than you. Typically, a brigadier could command a brigade.
Yeah.
I won't do that. There wasn't a brigade for a reservist to command when I was at that point. There is now, which is fantastic. And a fantastic colleague of mine is command of that brigade at the minute. But a brigade could be anything between sort of 2,000 or 3,000 people, and sometimes at war, it's certainly in Afghanistan, 6,000 to 7,000 people in most recent military conflicts. That sounds huge, and often civilians think that's a huge, big command, and it is. But of course, there are various levels of command below that. I commanded a regiment, and that's typically a lieutenant colonel, which you go lieutenant colonel, then full colonel, and then brigadier. So, the types of jobs you do as a brigadier in both the regular army and the reserve more typically are policy related or planning, capability and acquisition, personnel, training policy, those types of things. So it's often commanding a desk with teams of people working for you as well.
Brilliant. Taking it back to, I guess, maybe, I mean, you tell me maybe what age, but when was that first time you thought you were looking for a role in the army? Do you remember that moment of it being a career aspiration for yourself, or maybe a calling?
I do actually, and it was fairly random. I remember I think I was about 15 or 16
Right.
and watching television. And I think it was Panorama or one of those types of documentaries. And they did just one episode on the first woman going through Sandhurst, because women only went through training there. It used to be a separate college for women, and men went to Sandhurst. And in the 80s, that changed. And they did a documentary. And whilst it was still a very different course than the one I ended up doing, I saw the iconic Sandhurst building. Yeah. They followed them and showed the sort of horse going up the step, all the things that people see as icons of the Sandhurst experience, and watched that and thought, oh, I could do that. And my dad was watching it with me. And I remember frequently him sort of bringing it back up again at other times in life. I wasn't 100% set on it then, but it came up again probably when I went off to, just as I went off to university. I thought, actually, uniformed service of some sort, and it was either the Navy or the Army I was thinking about.
And what was it the fact that you're seeing women do that? Or was it a combination of everything that you kind of saw in that TV show that kind of really thought, wait, this is something that I want to do and is obviously achievable from what you've seen? I
think at those times, the woman bit was important because there were a lot of opportunities that weren't open. I'd thought about the police force. My dad was a police officer. And even then, women's role was very different. I grew up in Northern Ireland, so the Army was very visible. But again, you didn't see many women. I guess I've always been a little bit guilty of trying to break the mold and do something that nobody else wanted to do, or do something that surprised people a little bit, perhaps, for good or for bad. Yeah. So maybe that was the route in.
And where does that come from in terms of, you clearly got an inbuilt, I guess, desire to serve or for duty? Where does that come from? You talked about maybe your father being a police officer in Northern Ireland. What are some of your maybe core memories of that maybe shaped that desire to be in a service-led role?
I think I was in every uniformed organisation. It wasn't conscious. I was in the Girls' Brigade. I joined the Army Cadet Force as soon as they would let girls in my school. I was in the St. John's Ambulance. Even that had a little uniform. And I say, partly I was surrounded in the Troubles. It was very overt. The Army was in the public eye. My dad's a policeman. My mum was a civil servant in the health service. So it probably mostly my mum. I think her public service, she did a lot of volunteering as well. There was definitely an ethos of service. And I don't mean that in a totally altruistic way. I just mean by default, the community looked out for each other where I grew up, and I enjoyed the activities. If aside from the service bit, I enjoyed the outdoors bit of it, the not being routine, the opportunity of, I say, doing something that's completely different that you couldn't do in any other way.
What were you seeing from your parents at that time in terms of their work and their behaviours that maybe subconsciously led you towards that career, and some of those formative observations that you saw in terms of how they were behaving, what they were doing, to clearly going above and beyond most people? But what did that look like as a child?
I guess some of it, it's almost the paradox of the bad bits of it. My dad, I think we've talked before, my dad was shot quite early in the Troubles, quite seriously injured. And he did get back to work. But nowadays, I think he would have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. That wasn't a term that was used. And also, not only because of his own injury, but also he saw many of his friends severely injured and killed. And growing up, there was a real chaos and tension at home, always trying to not upset dad. My mum working very hard to just keep family together. So it was tough, but actually there's resilience that comes from that too, I think. And I saw what my parents sacrificed for us and for their own family, to stay there, and to, a lot of people just left Northern Ireland. But they stayed to, because of family and because of their role in community.
What was it like for you being, the daughter to a police officer that's been shot? Was it quite a scary time? Were you always worrying what dad was doing? And and what was going on around you, or like, because you see it now and you see it in documentaries around the Troubles, but to be growing up in that and being so close to home, literally, what did that kind of look and feel like?
It's funny because yes, it's crazy to look back at it, because yes, I think there was a constant fear, but we weren't really conscious of it because that was normality.
Normal.
It was so constant that it was normal, not being able to answer the doorbell when it rang, or constantly having to watch out for something. And it wasn't just us, the many people around me, whether their parents were in the security forces or not, there was a tension, there was a watching your back. There were numerous people at my school whose parents or siblings were killed. And I'm not saying it was just normal. Clearly, it wasn't normal, but it was normal for us. Yeah. And you just sort of head down and got on with it.
It's that thing, isn't it? I think nowadays with social media and everything on TV, it's so easy to almost see and feel and empathize with what's going on in different parts of the world. Mm-hmm. Whereas, to your point, and if that's all you know, it is your normal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, guns in the house. My dad always had to have his personal protection weapon. But passing soldiers with rifles in their arms. I could show my age on a podcast. I was born in 71. That Bloody Sunday, the Troubles, all of that. There were people carrying guns right beside you in the street, and you didn't give it a second thought.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's quite shocking. Would I choose to take my children to go and live somewhere where there was that threat? No, but I didn't know any different.
Yeah. Did your dad ever talk about the why and his purpose and why he persevered through that and didn't? No,
both my parents are dead now, and it's funny because you wish you'd asked them things earlier, but he joined the police before the Troubles started.
Yeah.
And it's not to say everything was rosy in Northern Ireland before the Troubles started, but he came from the city of Armagh, which was quite a mixed community and in religious terms. But he grew up, or from what I know, he grew up with friends from both sides of the community, and he joined the police to be a policeman. He regretted what he had to be, in a way that it was a different type of policing. But certainly, so the stories he told, and people have told me about him, he was respected by both sides of the community in Northern Ireland. I don't like that phrase, both sides of the community, but it's typically used about Northern Ireland. And, we grew up with friends of all religions and none. And my dad certainly was respected by people from leaders from both sides of the community.
Yeah, well, you've obviously referred to that moment of, watching it on TV and thinking, I want to do that. Kind of progressing through those formative years and maybe into your late teens. And when was that next moment around actually starting to formulate a plan of actually you wanted to become in the army? What did that actually look like in practice?
Well, I thought ahead of me at school, there were a few people kept what they did quite quiet if they went into the forces. So sometimes you bump into them years later and I didn't even know you joined. But there were a few friends of mine who had joined the Navy a few years ahead of me. And they were saying, you'd love the Navy. And women were just about to go off to sea. And I thought about that. And then I decided I would go to university first because, your years at university were credited to some degree in military service. And then very early in my first year at university, saw an ad in a newspaper. And it was literally in the days, I really do feel old talking about this. We had to cut that out and put it in an envelope and send it back. But the advertisement was a woman standing, and the byline was, as a woman in the army, or I think it was as a female officer or something, a woman in the army, you can cook, clean, and do the dishes. And they had a young officer cooking over a hexy burner, cooking in a mess tin, if you like, cleaning a rifle and moving a satellite dish. So it was quite clever for its time.
Yeah.
Women, sort of a generation below me, saw that advertisement recently and went, that is so sexist and ridiculous. But it was funny. We took it as funny and we liked it. And many of my colleagues joined, my peers joined off the back of that advertisement.
Really?
And so I filled it in, sent it off. And I remember that the day I went for my very first interview, it wasn't a formal interview, but very first interview was the day after the first Gulf War started. And I'd been up all night listening to the radio to what was happening in the Gulf. And then went for my interview the next day. And
What was that moment like when you told, and you kind of said that, your dad had said a couple of times or referred to off the back of you watching it on TV? Were they very supportive of you going into, the army, or what was that kind of conversation like and the support?
Yeah, I think they were. I mean, again, times change and what people might think of of being an officer in the army or in any of the professions has probably changed. But, a generation ago, my grandparents were still wartime, remembered the war. There was a different consciousness in society about defence, and particularly in Northern Ireland, I suppose. And they were definitely very proud when I got selected to go to Sandhurst, and very, very supportive. It made things difficult when you went back to Northern Ireland because you had to keep, had to tell lies about what you were doing, and watch where you went and be a bit careful. But yeah, they were proud of what I was doing, definitely.
What was, because it's interesting, you referred to it a couple of times, you're really on that transition of the first time, women were going to war or in uniform, or whatever it may be. And when you then get selected for Sandhurst, that must be obviously an incredible moment. It's very famous. But what did that then look like in terms of going into that? And actually just for the people that were joining that year, what did that look like in terms of women versus men?
But in those days, and until, I was going to say relatively recently, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, women were integrated in the training with men, did the same course as men when I went there. But we were you break down into different sections, groupings. And so there was one female platoon in my intake. So that's typically up to 30 people. There were only about 27, 28 of us, and not that many finished for various reasons, mostly injuries. And then it's kind of a rule of threes, 3 platoons in a company. So there was one female platoon and 2 men's platoons, and we formed a company. And then there was another all-male company. And in fact, the intake that I passed out with 2 full male companies and our company, which was two male platoons and 1 female platoon.
And how long was you at Sandhurst for?
Everybody says it's a year, but it's like an academic year. So an academic year without the breaks, but 11 months. 11 months.
Going into that, what were your aspirations? Did you have a longer term goal or idea of what you wanted that role in the army to look like, or what did it take me to that stage?
No, I didn't, and I reflect on that a lot actually, because I think this is where you see the impact of role models, and there weren't that many women ahead of us. No. There were certainly no women I knew at the time ahead of me who'd had children, because actually it used to be you had to leave when you had children. And even before that, women used to have to leave when they got married. Yeah. But thankfully I was, ahead of that stage or behind that stage. But there were no women I knew. There were probably some hidden, but we were such a small minority and a huge army dispersed. So I didn't have any role models of women who had managed a career, stayed in, with children, married. There were just none. So I was doing it with the presumption that I would leave once I had to.
Yeah. Were you feeling then, because it's difficult, I guess, in the moment when, again, you're not really seeing those role models ahead of you, and it's certainly difficult to think around, okay, almost the legacy or you're going to leave, but did you feel as a bit of a trailblazer in terms of actually, from a female perspective in the army, that you're potentially going to become a role model, which I'm sure you have become for many over the last few years?
I definitely didn't feel that I was a trailblazer. The women around me were, I looked in awe at many of the ladies that I went through training with. Many of them had been in the officer training corps at university. I'd been in the cadets at school, but that was, a different level. And they were so accomplished and and probably more ambitious. I think Northern Ireland, as well as having its trouble, it kind of sat about 10 years behind socially in terms of progression. It was a bit more traditional. So even out with defence, I didn't know many professional women in Northern Ireland. Even in my teachers were the only female professionals, and occasional doctors. But I didn't know any female lawyers. I didn't know many senior women police officers. It just wasn't, those role models weren't really there. So, and whilst with hindsight, it was early days for women going through Sandhurst, we were 2 or 3 years into that. So it didn't feel like we were the first. Yeah. And I was quite lucky in many ways. There's not many jobs that I've done where I've been the first woman. I know for women who are in that position, it can be quite tricky. Yeah. If certainly if it's publicized or if it's overplayed, it can be quite tricky.
Yeah. What do you remember in terms of the perception versus reality of going to Sandhurst and joining the army? Maybe things that you perceived, but when you were actually in there, they were very different. Did anything really stand out from that perspective?
I guess maybe once I was in my first job, when you're a troop commander, a platoon commander, they're the same sort of thing. It just depends what organisation and whether you called it a troop or a platoon. Yeah. It was a troop for us. So I'd, actually ended up in that first job with 75 people I was responsible for, which...
Your first job?
In my first job. Now, of course, I had a platoon staff sergeant and other people, who were making sure they kept me right. That's the premise in the British Army. The senior soldiers kind of train the officers. Yeah. It's unusual globally, but it's the way the British Army does it. So you've always got somebody keeping you right. So you're in charge, but you know very well who you need to go to for advice. But having thought that it was people think of it as a masculine job, the army, or certainly it is a physical job in many ways. But the skills for that first job were much more motherly, if you like. I think the welfare of your soldiers is the primary concern of any leader. Yes, if you go to war, clearly you've got a mission and a task and a purpose. And sometimes that in the short term, the physical welfare you have to set aside. But the thing that gives us moral credibility is the fact that you care about your soldiers. Yeah. And I shouldn't say that's a female trait. Of course, it's not just a female trait, but it certainly wasn't alien to be a woman, perhaps more empathetic. Again, I think my upbringing made me a wee bit more empathetic because I was often having to tiptoe around difficult emotional situations. And so being able to read your soldiers, to mentor them, to make sure they were doing the right things for their career, that wasn't a masculine part of the job at all. Yeah. And so it was quite a relief to go and actually feel, well, I can do this. I can do this just as well as the guy next door.
Did you feel so equipped from what you'd done at Sandhurst that you felt ready and I guess that you could thrive in that role? Or what were the kind of emotions? Did you have a sense of whether it's imposter syndrome or just a level of you needed some of that support next year? How did you feel stepping in and leading 75 people in your first role?
You kind of get carried along because it's what you do. You do know that's what you're going to go and do. Yeah. Sandhurst trains. It's changed a lot very recently, but only very recently. But in our time, it trained primarily around what we call an infantry model. So, what people see as being the basic soldiering skills. And they do that because it's a good tool to train leadership in the round. You don't learn much about your technical profession. And I went into logistics in the army. You do another course after Sandhurst to do that. And you get told all the way through Sandhurst, don't worry, you'll always have your seniors to look to. You'll always listen to your staff sergeant. And to many degrees, that's true, as I've said. But actually, the responsibility sits with you as a leader, and you can take advice. And sometimes I got great advice, but actually, you're there for a reason. You're there because you've been trained to look at things differently. And sometimes I got bad advice, and sometimes I took bad advice, and sometimes I didn't. Sometimes I overruled and chose to do something my way. And it's a huge learning phase. It's the basis of everything else you do in the army is your first command. I did it on operations. I was back in Northern Ireland. So there was the added threat, I guess, of having my soldiers in an environment that was physically threatening to them. It focuses your mind on leadership for sure.
For sure. How do you balance that? You kind of touched upon it there, maybe the empathetic skills and being close and getting that trust from your how do you refer to them?
So often it's said subordinates, and I hate using that word because it sounds so hierarchical. But just the soldiers, my soldiers, but subordinate only in terms of a hierarchy. We have a very overt hierarchy, but it's not necessarily played out in the way that.
How do you strike that right balance of, we use the language warmth and edge, right? In terms of actually the support and the care versus actually the discipline and the performance and the co-direction of performance. How do you balance that in the right way, particularly when you're on operation?
Oddly, it's much easier on operations because the mission's really clear. Or that was 30 years ago. Possibly not as clear for some people in today's complex world. Leadership and operations, oddly, was easier. Everything else is taken care of in a different way. You're supported. Your meals are cooked for you. Everything is about succeeding on that mission. The soldiers are generally very focused. Doesn't mean things don't go wrong, but it's something I still think I struggle with. Is what we now call the warmth and edge in Canis. The ability to really care for your soldiers, but sometimes have to make decisions which individually are not the best thing or don't appear to be the best thing for them. If they're desperate to go and do a job or be promoted or to work in a specific area, and you have to say, look, you might think that's the best thing for you now. It might even be the best thing for you now, but it's not the best thing for the organization of the team. I don't think that's something I've ever found easy.
Really?
I think I really have to listen to the monkey on my shoulder, if you like, about that. And the Canis wheel of wise leadership, at the risk of sounding like I'm selling something, I've found useful ever since I started working within the Canis methodology of being able to think about the sustainability of the organization and that sometimes the greater good has to trump the individual. But it's tough when the person's sitting in front of you and they have a welfare need for you to say, no, sorry, I know your grandmother's died, but I can't spare you.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting in terms of, I've interviewed a few different people for the podcast from the world of sport. And I think in business, when you refer to leadership and metaphors and different examples, people tend to go to sport or the military as those different examples. But within sport and running businesses, that's not as critical as, sometimes for yourself, you'd have to be decisions based on life or death or careers and things like that. Talk to me around the process that's going through your mind, or maybe that you're trained in, from that decision-making side of things that can give you the confidence that you're going to make decisions for the greater good, if you like, and the common good. What does that actually look like in practice? Because that's serious decision-making under pressure. How does that look, and how do you become equipped in that?
So you are literally, we are literally taught a way of thinking. There's what's known now as the estimate process, and it's a formal set of processes that you go through. Now, sometimes in a command wartime situation, you won't have time to do anything more than a quick assessment, but you are taught to pause. Even in war, you're taught drills so that you do the immediate actions you need to do, and that you take time when you can to think. The estimate process can be done in many complex or less complex ways, but it effectively forces you to think of more than one course of action, and to score it, if you like, to measure it against different criteria. Your criteria might be given to you from above, or they might be things that you have to consider yourself that are more enduring, depending on the longevity of the task, or whether it's just a quick action. So there are lots of tools. Of course, the thing is, no tool is perfect, and I think I recognize also, as you get more senior in leadership, we need people who think differently. So whilst we need to have a doctrine, if you like, a way of thinking to allow us to work quickly and a shared understanding, that also brings with it a risk of people thinking too much the same way, groupthink. And because the military is bottom fed, effectively, yes, officers can go in to start as officers, but we can't bring somebody in at a higher level. Or traditionally you can't. There are ways and means now for that sort of NED type role. We need people who think differently. And so certainly the Forces is looking at how we don't filter out people who think differently.
I think that's quite interesting to hear from like a layman, if you like, because you'd almost think that everybody's taught to think the exact same way and make the exact same decision in the exact same circumstances.
And, 50 years ago, that might have worked, because you had your doctrine and, you that happened. But the world is too complex. And of course, if we all think the same, then it doesn't take the enemy long to work out what you're thinking, if we're in that type of scenario. So we really need to, get ahead of the thinking of the enemy. So you always need to have a different perspective. You want to put yourself in someone else's shoes all the time. And when you get into the strategic leadership sphere, a lot of what I'm learning about this year, you're considering the culture aspects of different nations, how things are perceived, how populations perceive the leadership above them, and the impact on, I think we know what's going on in the world, how, one country, one leader's decisions can impact the global sphere. And so, understanding other people's thinking, or understanding when you just can't predict what people are thinking and have to hedge against it, is really important.
Yeah, that lens of putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, something that you hear a lot around in our day-to-day work or in sport. What are the opposition going to do? How are we going to counteract that? What formation are we going to play in football? Whereas, it kind of really rings true when you say, what are the enemy going to do and what are they thinking? Talk me through that process of, stepping inside that and seeing things through that lens. Because that must be something that you do a lot, but it must be difficult.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, there are specialists in it,
Of course.
There are people whose job it is to gather intelligence about, that's no secret. There are people who become experts in that. But also we build into our planning processes things like, this is in business now too, red teaming. A lot of things that I hear back in my civilian roles, I'm like, where do you think that metaphor came from then? Yeah. But, red teaming and, just sort of wearing different hats, that type of idea, that comes from real life military things. Getting back to what you were really asking, what the enemy's thinking. Of course, the speed of change now is probably the biggest challenge. Again, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, change on the battlefield was quite, relatively slow. When we moved to armored tanks, that was a huge shift. When we moved to having aircraft in the RAF, huge shift in how warfare played out. But what's happened over the last 5 years is, onset of AI, drone technology, the shift in warfare is unprecedented, and it's only getting quicker. So we need to be constantly predicting and constantly changing, because the risk of falling behind is really huge.
In terms of maybe not a specific decision, but maybe sets of decisions, what did you find the hardest kind of decisions to make in your role, whether it's an operation or otherwise? What were the ones that were really the most difficult to make?
Gosh. I think if I was thinking back to the operation that was probably most challenging, and not because of threat to life, and I ran the port in Bosnia. Well, it wasn't in Bosnia, the port was in Croatia, bringing all of the assets in during the Balkans War, or actually after the Balkans War was over, but we've still had a lot of troops in keeping the peace in the Balkans. And the safety of soldiers, it was a really exhausting job at times, went through peaks and troughs. But making decisions over risk to life, and again, not because of enemy action, but because of fatigue, because of, we had regulations about how long people could drive, and, nighttime driving, numbers of people, being able to rotate through. But there was always risk there. And of course, taking risk with other people's lives is the inherent part of being it. But it's probably no different for somebody who works in the NHS. You're taking risk with other people's lives. That's really tough when you just can't control the factors around it, I think. So I'm trying to think of an example. I did have soldiers who got injured. Life-changing injuries. Thankfully, we didn't lose any soldiers close to me in that operation.
Do you feel the weight of those decisions in the moment, or are you just, I guess, depending on who you are, but knowing you, that in terms of that level of empathy and risk, but like the weight of those, when it is ultimately people join the army knowing they could lose their life and their lives are going to be at risk, but when it comes to the weight of those decisions, does that hang a little bit differently over you?
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the unusual things about the military and being a leader in the military is it's not just those people who have joined, it's their families too. Now that's changed over the years, but when I joined the army, most people were, we did our postings in Germany, posted around more. The army's more stable now than it used to be. And often, the spouses had given up their careers because the nomadic lifestyle wasn't good, or they were maybe taking a break because it was the time of life to have children. So you got to know your soldiers' families, their children, their partners, but you also had responsibilities. Certainly in Germany, we were, you were there. You weren't just looking after the soldier. Every decision you made when you said to them, sorry, leave's cancelled, you need to do this duty this weekend or this course this weekend. It wasn't just the soldier you were making miserable. It was other people too. And it's hard, but you realize you want to be respected for the job you're doing. Those sound like really trivial examples, but it's the weight of that, the weight of the impact of your decisions on everybody that in that family chain, I think.
Yeah.
It's different.
I can only imagine what that's like. You talked earlier on, just in your answer around defining great leadership, around influencing others to do something that they otherwise maybe wouldn't have done, and that being attached to a purpose. How do you do that? And whether it's people that are just working in businesses or schools or teams, but within the army and how you did that, what did that kind of look like in practice, the how behind that? Because that's obviously the secret sauce for getting the best and high performance out of people, but easier said than done, right?
Yeah, secret. I like that. Definitely secret sauce. I mean, again, a bit like when I said about ways of thinking, part of that ways of thinking is thinking about what your commander wants, but also what your two-up commander wants. So not just what does the boss want to do, but what does the boss's boss want to do? And if I said like a brigadier could be commanding a brigade, two up from that, one up from that's a division, two up from that we don't have in the British Army as a corps. We don't have a full corps. So you're really trying to get inside the head of the person two up. And so then you're thinking two down. Yeah. So you're thinking, well, how am I going to give translate their intent, the highest level intent, and the why. That's always the important bit, is the why, and make that relevant to two down. Simplifying it if necessary, because sometimes there's stuff that really it isn't necessary for all of everybody to know it. Not because they couldn't understand it, but because you want to keep them focused on their part in the plan.
Yeah.
The Army's always very much about the why. When you give a mission formally, it is, we're going to do this in order to. It's got the words in order to, and the in order to is the reason beyond it. And that allows you to also change the plan if something else happens that you're not expecting, because the in order to hasn't changed.
Yeah.
Does that
it's fascinating. Yeah. You said it earlier on in terms of just, the maybe two levels above, you're trying to think around what decisions would they make, or how does that actually look in practice in terms of, is there a line of communication, or is it just always, you're always speaking to one up, or is there broader, think around the business world of leadership all hands calls and conference calls and things like that. But what is there in terms of those different layers of the hierarchy coming together, or does it look different in terms of when maybe in your own operation and things?
Yeah, more and more now, because communication allows it. We do have huge sort of general staff dial-ins for, from the top of government, so MOD, civil servants. There's a lot of communication. Sometimes, I'm not saying there is too much, but there's a risk that there's too much, because actually that can dilute the message. The simple days of my youth, where every time my boss would give me an order, and that sounds very formal, would tell me what the next task was and what they wanted from it, they would be giving me their two up. So it's part of the culture of the language that you use in the military is, we're doing this because, and these are the boss's priorities here.
Yeah.
And we do it because you have to be, that's what allows delegation, and that's what allows empowerment. Only if you really know what they want to achieve even if an individual knows what their boss wants, knowing what their boss's boss wants gives them the freedom to go, John's not here today. I'm going to have to act without asking questions, without going back and begging for direction at every step. If I know what the two-up plan is, if I know what the two-up intention is, or the vision, the overarching vision, then I can act within it and know that I'm going in the right direction. Might not do exactly what they would have done. I fear that that's something that's at risk in terms of culture now, because it's far too easy to say, give me a ring if you need advice. Now, that's not a bad thing to say, but I think we overuse it. Because, early in my career, if you were duty officer looking after a camp with a couple of hundred, probably a couple of thousand in some cases, soldiers on it, your duty officer, you might have someone else on call, but by God, you better really need to be calling them, because they don't want to be disturbed. And you were making decisions way above what I think nowadays would be deemed normal. But you had to, because that was the duty and that was the responsibility.
What does that feedback look like in terms of how good a job you're doing and the decisions that you're making and the impact? What does that feedback look and feel like, with whether it is one up or two up, and you getting clarity on how well a job you're doing in terms of those decision making? I
mean, sort of formally, appraisal process is very defined in across all of defence, all the forces, quite similar. We've got a joint service publication. There's a joint service publication for everything. But we do have, typically across defence, we get an annual appraisal, and your performance is judged and your potential is judged separately by your one up. And then your two up, and this is I know I'm getting into this terminology. Your boss's boss also writes on you in your potential. They used to also write in performance, but it was just generally repeating what the one up said. And it recognizes two things there. It does recognize that somebody higher is looking for your real stretch potential, and they've got more experience. But also that performance and potential aren't necessarily, or performance isn't always the best indicator of potential. So you could be just performing adequately at your job, but you might have higher potential for something else. or vice versa. You could be brilliant at your current job and have no potential to proceed. And that's why they separate the two things out, because we're looking for something else. And in the military, usually that's a leadership function. And the different types of leadership, that tactical leadership at a junior soldier and junior officer level, operational leadership, and then strategic leadership as you get, I think you need to have the tactical and the operational to get to strategic, but not everybody enjoys the strategic.
Yeah.
You're moving away from soldiers. And for some people, staying with your soldiers and commanding your soldiers is the best bet. But there is no career profile that allows you to do that forever. So,
do you get pushback from soldiers or when you're making a decision, or is that just not allowed at all? If you give an order, that's like, what does that look like at all? Do people question it or push back, or what does it actually look like in terms of what's allowed or what's common within it?
I think it's quite unlike what people would expect. So when you give an order's an order unless it's an illegal order, but we don't go straight to that. We would often, there's always room to question, and you would hope that wouldn't be at the order stage, and I suppose I'm mixing situations here because, of course, in war, when you get an order, that's one thing. But of course, we're not at war all the time, but we use similar processes. Typically, when we are planning something that's going to require decisions to be made, we do bring everybody in and we expect them to, well, when I say everybody, clearly it wouldn't make sense to have every single person in the organization involved, nor would it be good leadership. But the best leaders I have seen definitely seek the views of those below them. And actually, often our officers are fairly general, not always, but they can't be specialists in everything that they look after. So you will go to the expert who may well be, a more junior rank and ask for advice. And then the other unusual thing, I think, is that because we do have rank and we wear it, it allows you to seek criticism in a different way. Because, you can say, well, Corporal Jones, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think? But we shouldn't say it that way around. I should ask them first. But if you said, Corporal Jones, this is what I think. What do you think? They'll happily say, I think that's barking, ma'am. But because they'll say, ma'am, at the end, there's no coup. They're not disobeying. You've asked them for their advice. And you say, okay, why? All right, okay. I hadn't even thought about that. Thank you. But because they can still show you respect for your rank.
Yeah.
They'll quite happily do it. And they'll give you the truth. If you ask a soldier to tell you the truth, they generally will, which is brilliant.
That's really good. I want to touch upon the concept of disciplined initiative, because this is something, within the world of what we do, we'd talk to yourself in terms of just in passing and joking. I know Dawn had said to you, it's easier for you in the army. You just tell people to do, and they just do it. And you came back and said quite the opposite. Talk to us a little about disciplined initiative. What is that concept and why it is so critical within the army? And I think we can refer to it in businesses as well.
Yeah, and I think this is again how warfare has changed over the years. Soldiers have a huge amount of responsibility, even very junior soldiers. We talked in the days of Iraq and Afghanistan about the strategic corporal, because a corporal is a level who'd be out commanding maybe 8 people on a patrol. And if they do something wrong, really wrong, or even if they struggle and look a bit daft, somebody could be there with a camera, somebody's recognizing what they do. The impact of what a corporal, they've gone up 2 ranks since they joined the army, could have a really strategic effect. If that's all over the news, or they've gone against policy, they've made some mistake. We have to be able to trust our soldiers. Some mistakes will happen. We're human, but we don't just give orders and expect them to be carried out in that way. And it comes back to that bit about the why. Disciplined initiative for me, and we call it mission command in the military, is about giving people their, again, another military metaphor, their left and right of arc. You know, this is the direction I want you to go. Don't go further than this in that direction, and don't go further than this in that direction. And those are the constraints. And those could be, when I take that into business, those constraints might be financial. You know, this is what I want you to do. This is the most amount of money that you're going to get to invest. You know, I'd rather you were down here somewhere. It might be there's an option of detaching more troops to support you in this task. You know, come and tell me if you need them. You know, so that sort of iterative cycle and planning is very normal in the military before there's a formal order. And even after the formal orders, you know, there will be opportunities for a feedback loop of, okay, boss, I've gone away and I've tried to make my plan based on what you've ordered me to do. Here's where I think my risks are. And if you could just give me X or Y, that would mitigate that. Or it might be, you know what, boss, this is easy. Actually, I've got a corporal who can do that tomorrow, and I don't even need all of the resources.
Yeah, great. Well, for you personally, everybody talks, and I'm terrible at switching off from work. But what's that like in terms of when you're coming away from operation or back to your young family, whatever it may be? Are you quite good at switching off, or what does that look like for yourself personally? Because you've got, imagine, some big stuff on your mind a lot, but how does that look for you personally?
Yeah, you know, I'm not good at it. And of course it's different because I moved to be a reservist, and mostly I've been back and forward between full-time and part-time, but mostly when the children were young, I was doing part-time. But I think your point remains true in that, because whilst I wasn't necessarily away in operations then, I did, you know, I was getting paid to do a part-time job that was permanently in my mind, because you're still commanding those people. You're still looking after those people's welfare, whether you're on duty or off duty. So I'm not very good at it, and I have to work quite hard at doing it. But then it's also the bit of the job I enjoy.
Yeah. If people were to Google Brigadier Gill Wilkinson, they'd probably come across a BBC article about you and your husband, Alan, which is amazing. Can you just talk a little bit around that? Because I know you cringe and you don't like talking about it, but it's obviously a moment in history within the British Army. So
it was. I cringe because the press stuff I do find it tricky, and I'll probably come to why. So yes, so I commanded, was really proud and really lucky to command 154 Scottish Regiment, the Royal Logistic Corps, which is a transport regiment headquartered in Dunfermline and squadrons across the central belt of Scotland. The most amazing soldiers. Had served in the unit before, and to go back and command it was just brilliant. Amazing people, and many of them still serving in the regiment. Alan, my husband, took over from me in command in that job. And that was the first time that had happened in the British Army, where I think it was the first time a married couple had handed command one to the other. And very definitely the woman to the man. Funnily, when people mention it, and I see people all the time who either saw the article or saw something about it, go, oh yeah, your husband handed his regiment to you, didn't he? They all assume it was the other way around. And it's like, no, why is it presumed to be that way? Yeah. But
that must be fun to tell them, though. Actually, you got that very wrong.
Yeah. It is fun. And Alan's great like that, because he, it's more questions, because I am more senior now. Alan took a break for a while after command. He's now a reservist as well, and has a civilian job. But people often say to him, oh, what's it like to have a wife who's senior to you? And nobody once asked me that when I was junior to him, you know, what it was like that my husband was senior to me. Never once did anybody mention it. But as soon as I overtook Alan in rank, it became an issue, which is funny. And it's always nice to just pop that back. And Alan's the best advocate when that question is asked, because he just goes, sorry, I don't get your point. What do you mean? You know, what's the issue? But I mean, we get it, but it's just a bit early. At the time when all that stuff came out in, you know, it was on Facebook, and there was it never ceases to amaze me what some people think is appropriate to put on Facebook. And it wasn't people who knew either of us, or even people who were in the military. But I do find it difficult, some of the the public stuff that goes with it.
Yeah, I can imagine. What was it like, life, as partners and husband and wife working in the army? What was that actually like?
Yeah, you talk about taking a break and switching off. That was tricky to do sometimes because you just end up living it. We did both work in the same regiment once together. In fact, it was that time when I was managing the port that was bringing everything into Bosnia. We weren't co-located, which was good, and we wouldn't have chosen even to be in that situation. I found it quite tricky, and not that I found it tricky to do. We were the same rank, but Alan was in a senior position. He was a regimental ops officer. I was a squadron ops officer. It was other people's perceptions of it often. There was often wee comments. I'd phone up to speak to him in a work business, and someone would say, "Is your wife on the phone?" It's like, "Oh no, it's not." In this sense, so it wouldn't be ideal working in the same unit. I think it's tricky, but we work together at home and manage it. We're very different. We've got very different styles.
I was going to ask around that because in terms of that leadership handover, I remember you talking around it, and you've maybe referred to it a little bit today in terms of you almost felt like those motherly instincts of actually handing over the squadron. What would they have seen and felt different in terms of, maybe you said there's different leadership styles across the army, as there quite rightly should be. What are the biggest differentiators between yourself and Alan?
He's the empathy bit, which is a good and a bad with me. I think that's the bigger. It's not that Alan's not empathetic, but he's much more process driven, and I always admired that. That's my weakness. I think we complement each other in that way. Of course, for soldiers looking up to you, they probably enjoy the empathetic warmth bit. Yeah. So Alan's got more edge, definitely. I need more edge, and I'd look back, but it's tricky because the other thing is, when you leave a regiment, when you leave command, the norm is that you don't hang around, you don't show your face for a couple of years, and you let the next commanding officer get on with it and do their thing, and that's trickier for him when I'm his wife. Yeah. So it wasn't easy. Yeah. It wasn't easy.
In businesses, particularly at larger scale, whether they're enterprise businesses, they'll have an overarching culture, but there'll naturally be subcultures in terms of how they, different offices, different divisions and things like that. What does that look like in terms of the army, in terms of different squadrons or companies, in terms of maybe the different subcultures within them, depending on who they are, who they're led by, what they're doing?
Oh, it's a huge thing in the army.
Is it?
A huge thing. And there's a constant debate about the benefits versus the risks. So all the different cap badges, for instance, all the, even I suppose the best example from my perspective is when I did go into that very first job, my corps, the Royal Logistic Corps, was fairly new. It had amalgamated, and the bits of the corps that were still present, or the bits of the forming corps that were still present in my squadron, my subunit, were from the Royal Corps of Transport and the Royal Army Ordnance Corps. So they're now all Royal Logistic Corps soldiers. They all wear the same cap badge, but they had come from one of the other two. Yeah. So culturally, they had different sort of habits, just a different culture. And they were forming a new culture. And the stores troop, who I commanded at first, were from the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, and the other two troops were predominantly from the Royal Corps Transport. And as soldiers did in those days, there would be fights. Not bad fights, but there was banter. Yeah. And there probably were a few fights in the block because they had names for each other. The ordnance were the stackers and the truckies, and it was fun. But the minute you ended up at a regimental function, so that was 11 Squadron I was in, very proud to be Stores Troop Commander 11 Squadron, and our troops would be squabbling against each other. As soon as there was a regimental function and it was another squadron that was the mirror image of our squadron, it becomes squadron versus squadron. Yeah. So my Middle Eastern friends on the course I'm on at the minute describe this as I fight against my brother. I fight against my brothers, but I fight with my brothers against my cousins. It's that sort of idea. Who's your lowest common denominator and what next? And then it would be regiment against regiment. And everybody's forgotten whether you're a truckie or a stacker, because we're now fighting against the Army Air Corps, So so cap badge mentality. And it breeds competition, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
But when that competition, tribalism can be a good thing, but you need to know when it is a good thing and when it's not. And I guess that's, as a leader, as a commander, that's where you always have to keep this constant mediating eye, riling up your soldiers against something for good purposes, but being able to restrain it.
What was the process like when you moved to different roles or leading different squadrons, in terms of maybe you've analysed it a little bit and observed for a little, the influence that you then have on potentially shaping a culture, and what culture would you want to shape within the what you led?
I think the trickiest times for that have been in the reserve. No, it's a very different culture. There's still an overarching, military service culture. But of course, these people are part-time and they're not living the military life 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In the regular world, certainly in my early days when people did all live together on a base, the culture thing just happened. It's just the way things were done. In the reserves, the people are motivated much differently, and it's not as transactional in a way. It's much more, well, why is he here? Why is she here? What are they looking for from this? So that was harder to create, or harder to make a change to a culture, because you would have different people there all the time, and I found that tricky. But really rewarding when it worked. Yeah. And finding the agents, if you like, the people who got it, and really empowering them to bring others on.
What have you had to really lean into the most in your own journey and development as a leader, of whether it's development areas, blind spots that you've had to really have front and focus in terms of being able to make sure that you're getting better at that to get the best out the people that our soldiers you are leading?
It's hard to know whether I've leaned into the right things enough. It's easy with hindsight, isn't it? But the negative is, I think I would be too drawn to the emotional bit of it.
Yeah.
I might very quickly think, oh, that's just.
Did you get told at all? Sorry to butt in there, but in terms of, did you get told at all when you're climbing the ranks that you're ever too emotionally involved in that way at all, or was that?
No, I don't think so. I think I have been able. I mean, I don't know whether I'm being hard on myself.
Probably.
I just know the quandary it puts in me.
Yeah.
I've been able to make the tough decisions.
Really, yeah.
But I don't find them easy. I don't find it easy.
Yeah.
And things stay with me. I ruminate for years about things. Gosh, if I'd just done something differently.
Yeah.
And that in some ways that might sound great that I cared that much, but it's not great when you need to focus and put something, head in a different direction.
Yeah. Anything else stand out that maybe was a need to focus on or wanted to work on? How did you find the typical standing up and leading others and giving orders? Did that come quite naturally to yourself, or how did that kind of develop?
That is one that, Sandhurst, because the training you go through at Sandhurst where you're doing that. Yes, you're doing it with your peers, really.
Yeah.
But you're doing it when you're exhausted. You're doing it when you're wet and you're muddy. You're doing it when you haven't slept for 3 days. So actually, when you hit the real life commanding, the standing up and giving orders bit, if it is that, that's what your soldiers expect of you. Actually, it's not. That wasn't or didn't feel tricky at the time. It's harder when you're having to give bad news, or it's harder when you're having to ask for something that is maybe an emotional challenge for soldiers. If there were very busy periods where soldiers were going away 6 months out of every 18 months, missing births of children, those types of things. I don't think that was ever the hardest thing. It's harder now. I'm an older lady. Sort of forget words and forget my train of thought. And I worry more about that sort of thing now. But that was part of the culture, actually. Yeah. And actually most even very junior soldiers, that's something that gets trained in very early.
Yeah.
Is, a lance corporal looks after typically 4 people, but they could easily be stepping up or one of them with real specialist skills. I've seen lance corporals, so let me think, maybe 21 years old, been in the army 3 or 4 years, briefing audiences of 300, 400 people because they are the specialist in a skill. And that is, overcoming any fear or of an audience or of just giving your opinion is something that a lot is invested in our soldiers from the very earliest stages to make them able to do.
There's obviously, again, from the outside looking in, you see how difficult that transition can be from soldier to civilian, and people making that really tough, particularly if there's PTSD involved and things there. But what does the army do to try and equip and support people? I imagine it's changed dramatically now, people going into civilian life, because they've still got a good few decades ahead of them as a civilian. But what does that kind of transition look like? Because it seems from the outside looking in to obviously be really, really difficult.
Yeah, and it varies. There is a program, a career transition program. It's having a bespoke system is probably the more difficult thing because everybody is so different. It's different in Scotland than it is in England. The employment market changes. I think so. There's a lot there. Sometimes soldiers and officers don't access it because they don't think they need it.
Yeah.
Or they'll go straight into a job because they've been offered one, but it might not be the one that they really want to be in a year's time. And that's when they re-engage often with careers organizations and transition programs. One of the difficulties of the military and society now is there are so few people who have routine contact with the military or who have parents who were in service or grandparents. And often there is this notion, there is PTSD, there are people who've seen awful things. And of course, there needs to be a safety net there and welfare organizations to support veterans who've been through the worst. But actually, most soldiers do not leave like that.
Of course. Most
of them are ready and able, but the good news stories don't make the news. And I sometimes, it's really important that we lobby for support, but we also need to be mindful that there's a bit of a mad, bad and sad narrative. And none of them are all of those, but a lot of people are very resilient, very able to make the transition.
Yeah, for sure. And you see it now, a lot of them, whatever they go into, how equipped they are and how strong a person they are. And I can only imagine what kind of, whether it's when you're coming through the ranks or you're at Sandhurst, what are the key traits and skills that you are picking up to really equip you with? You kind of talked about there, you're obviously going to get pushed to immense levels of probably stress and tiredness and then having to make decisions. What stands out from you from your time at Sandhurst that was maybe a stage or process that you went through that really equipped you to be confident and competent in that role when you...
I think it is just getting it done no matter what, the bad day stuff. And this is what I see in my soldiers, and particularly my reserve soldiers, having spoken to many of their civilian employers, and they'd say, you wouldn't believe how much they stand out from their completely civilian peers. For instance, in a story, was a delivery driver, one of my drivers from my regiment who had recently started working for a logistic company. And the manager who came to an event said to me, they were sent off to deliver something. The address was wrong on the invoice for a start. They got to a place. He said, any of the rest of my drivers would have just brought the package back. And your driver found out who it was really for, by speaking to 5 different people, phoning up, and delivered the package, even though the address was wrong. Now, that sounds a bit trivial, not trivial, a bit low level, but it's typical for me of the problem solving.
Yeah.
I'm out to deliver this. Why would I turn around and go back if I can do a bit more and make it work? And that person had been, they'd been in operations. Sometimes obstacles get in your way and you've got to find a way around it.
Yeah.
And just knowing that, even when the chips are really down and times are tough and it's bucketing with rain and you're carrying a heavy pack, tomorrow will come and you'll get through. You'll get through, and preferably you'll get through in good order, having delivered the task, the parcel, the rounds down the range, whatever the metaphor needs to be.
Does a moment stand out for yourself, or whether it's a role or a specific moment in time that's made you most proud as a leader?
I'm sure many officers would say command, and commanding that Regiment 154, particularly if I think back to the regiment, or about half the regiment went on an exercise to America when I was in command, and they were deploying as a squadron, so below regimental level. And I was out there to view the exercise, and I was just so proud of them. Honestly, my subunit commander, who was out there at the time, Major Ray Watt, I remember him meeting me and taking me to see the soldiers. And honestly, I was just burnt with pride, but Ray was an easy person to have put there because he was just a superstar. Brilliant. And happy soldiers, they impressed the American colleagues who they were integrated with so much. And I just thought, gosh, if people at home could only see what these, part-time soldiers who are at work in numerous jobs across Scotland, Monday to Friday, if they could see the impression that they're making and the effect that they're having on another army, on an exercise, on just their attitude and their positivity, was unbelievable. Yeah. And there's nothing like that just to make you sort of feel proud. Yeah.
It's probably that. It probably refers back to the influence you've had on them in terms of that, your definition of great leadership, and you being able to see that in practice. For you now, if you were a 15, 16-year-old right now and seeing what's going on in the world and in the army, how do you think you'd be feeling sitting watching, instead of watching what you watching the TV back then? How do you think you'd feel in terms of that push or pull towards the army?
God, it's really hard to know because so much has changed, doesn't it? I think actually I was, despite growing up in that troubled area, in many ways that left me very naive because Northern Ireland had its own troubles and we didn't look that far outside. The Cold War, I lived through a lot of it and didn't really feel like I was waiting for a nuclear bomb to go off. It wasn't the closest threat. Nowadays, I think that the narrative is changing in the UK and elsewhere. I think people are starting to be aware that if you don't have security, you don't have stability. And if you don't have stability, then your economy, a lot of the course I'm doing this year is about those things, not defense in itself, but security is the first thing that a population needs. And, recent events we're here in April now, 2026, you can see how the impact of, oil on stability across the world, and the economy, what it does to the economy. And it's just a circle of how, populism is being fed by a lack of those other factors. Yeah. I just hope that the 15 and 16-year-olds watching it aren't despairing. I think they've got to realize that the world needs to have good young leaders in the future, and they need to play their part. There was such a move towards, after the Cold War and until relatively recent times, towards greater stability and young people being able to influence to try to build a better, more ethical world. And ideally, we can be really idealistic, but the bottom line is if we don't have security, we can't be idealistic about everything else. So
yeah, and I think it's an interesting point that you raise in terms of, and I guess it's only relative to where you're at in moment in time, but yes, you realize more than ever now in terms of running a business, or you turn on the news, you see the economy, the price of fuel, young family, the rest of it. It's just how quickly it can change daily at the moment. Mm-hmm. And it isn't it's the threats from not close by, it's a long way away, and how quickly it can swing. So never before have we wanted and needed great leadership, which is the opposite of what most of us are seeing.
Mm-hmm. And the amplification of the effect of poor leadership, of toxicity, of I don't want to be political, but of the very short-termist views, of not thinking through the impact, and just not really showing care for humanity and society. People think that there's that maybe that defense is the hard edge, but of course defense is only there for when everything else has failed. And for the most part in defense, we want to promote stability and security. And so it doesn't mean, people working in defense, whether they're in uniform or whether they're in industry or whether they're in civil service, the goal is to avoid war and not to wage it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating time, for sure. A few quickfire questions to finish with, Gill. It's been so insightful, and I think a lot of people have hopefully taken plenty away from both learning things around the army, but there's so much that can be taken into business, education, sport, and otherwise. So I really appreciate it. We have started the Leaders Unlocked library. A lot of people read, they listen to books, whether it's podcasts and things that maybe influence and shape their own behaviour. There's a few classics in there that I may or may not have read. But is there a book that stands out for yourself that you'd recommend to others that's really supported you with, whether it's leadership or otherwise?
Yeah, I've noticed that I'm recommending one book over and over to people, actually, and it was one that one of the other ladies who works for Canada recommended to me, and it's called Gravitas by Carolyn Goyder. I recommend it a lot to young women who I've been mentoring, and it's not specifically for women, but I think it's something's always concerned me about being a wee Northern Irish woman who works in logistics and a part-timer at that, in an organization that is culturally very different, and that maybe I didn't have gravitas. And it doesn't, if you're commanding those 30 soldiers or 75 soldiers or 100 soldiers who know you well, I think you can lead them without having any, you don't need to think about gravitas. You've got authenticity. But in the world I'm working in now, and many other women are working in, you sometimes have to just make an immediate impact. You don't have the time to build up the trust and the authenticity and people knowing the credibility and the competence that you've got. You really need to have gravitas from day one. And that book is such an easy read it's mostly about communication and being able to improve impact from the start. So that's one that I've been recommending to lots of people.
That's a great recommendation. Thank you. Are great leaders born or developed?
Developed. I think we've got traits that help. I've used it as a hand of cards sometimes. If your personality traits are your hand of cards, you won't win with that same hand of cards in every context. So it's how you play them.
Yeah, really good. I like that. If you could go for a coffee with one leader and pick their brains for a couple of hours, who would it be and what would you want to ask them?
Do you know, I thought about this because I've been listening to some of your other podcasts, and that's so hard. But Kamala Harris, I just would be fascinated, partly to hear her reflections now on both her time as vice president, but what more she would reflect on that could have been done to influence the world differently.
Yeah. That'd be an interesting, there'll be a lot of good things to come out of that, and interesting for sure. What's your most important non-negotiable as a leader?
I think was going to say trust, but trust comes from honesty. I think those, if we put those two together, if I'm allowed to do that.
Yeah, for sure.
If you don't have that, then you'll never reach high performance, in my view. It's important to delegation, and you have to be able to delegate people and trust them. Doesn't mean they're always not going to make mistakes, but it's got to be the basis.
What's one word that defines your leadership style?
I was thinking about this too. I'll say energetic, although I don't always feel it.
Yeah. Great. I agree from what I've seen.
That's because I've had 2 coffees.
When you're leading a team, which behavior are you least tolerant of?
I was going to say individualism, but I suppose selfishness.
Yeah.
If it's a team, it's a team.
Yeah. So
people looking for individual credit. I recognize that in a hierarchical organization, you see it, but the best performance, I would say allow people above you to see your performance without you having to go and display it to them, as in deliberately.
Yeah. I think it's for that, it's almost like you should be able to say to them, particularly in something like the army, if you're seeing selfishness, it's like you're in the wrong place. Yeah. Like you couldn't be in more the wrong place. What's the most underrated leadership quality in your eyes?
Patience. And I'm guilty, but I'm not always patient enough. But again, as you go further up, where decisions are probably less immediate, but also we need to wait longer for results sometimes. I think we're in a constant cycle of needing to see impact straight away, and that's really tricky. And often we should adjust if things aren't going well, but patience to make a decision when it's needed, but if it doesn't need to be made now, then maybe we need to take time and be more considerate before we do fast changes of direction.
Yeah, great. What 3 words would your teammates, colleagues, soldiers use to describe Gill Wilkinson?
See, I've been the victim of many 3s, or at least 180s or 360s. And of course, even though it's supposed to be anonymous, they do say that I'm caring and empowering. So I'm really proud that people say that, because that's what I would like them to say. 3 things. What did I think? Did I write some down? Committed.
Yeah.
Committed.
I would definitely see that. Sure. And I think it's anything else?
Thoughtful was the other word I was thinking about as she sits for a moment thinking.
Yeah.
I'd like to think I'm getting more thoughtful and trying to be less instinctive.
Yeah.
I think that comes anyway as you move through roles.
Become more wise.
Yeah. Wise leadership. Yeah. Trying to become more wise.
So there's something in there in terms of the connection between thoughtfulness, patience, to your point, everybody right now, whether it's social media clicks or business results, they want to do something today and see the results tomorrow. And I think people are just realizing now that that's that short-termism. You've talked about what's going on right now, and globally, there's just almost everything that's happening right now is almost for short-term gain and credit, if you like, rather than what is the long-term sustainable impact of this. So there's a lot can be taken away from that. Who are the 2 people that have had the biggest influence on you as a leader and as a person?
Again, thought about this because I've been listening to your other podcasts. And a lady called Hilary McCloy, who was my PE teacher at school. And actually, I thought many of those who played hockey, and I remember Hilary wrote a reference for me to do what was then called Operation Rally International. And I saw it. And I do think that was a really pivotal thing, because she saw things in me that I wasn't reflective. I was just instinctive. I was the hockey team captain, but the confidence she had to recommend me and give me a reference for something was pivotal, because I had huge respect for her.
Would she ever know how grateful you are?
I hope so. I did tell her. I saw her, and it's a long time since I've seen her, and I keep thinking, next time I'm back in Derry, I'm going to call in and see her. But I did tell someone else, a friend of hers, that once, that, you know, how important she was. And then actually, I have to say, and it's not romantic, but Alan, my husband, he's always had such faith in me, even when I didn't. And partly because our styles are so different. He saw the things that I could do that he couldn't do, and vice versa. But he has really encouraged me when I've not felt sometimes that I could go for things.
Best team environment you've been a part of, and why?
Probably go back to that Balkans job, because it was operational, it was multidisciplined, expertise sat at a really low, rank-wise sat at a really low level, and I've never worked with such a well-oiled team. You know, as the port operators from 17 Port Maritime Regiment, we were a real composite team that came together, and it's a bit like a rugby team. Everybody had a different role, but on the pitch. So that was fantastic.
Great.
Job to do.
If you could have a 5-minute conversation with that 15-year-old Gill, what would you say to her?
Oh, that is tough, because that was probably the toughest time when I was about 15, actually. I think I'd say nothing lasts forever. Good days, good times, bad times. You know, life is peaks and flows. And, I'm only realizing this now. I was going to say also not to be scared of failure and to just go for it. But I remember Hilary McCloy more or less telling me something like that, where she said, do you hold back so that if you don't make it, it's as if you weren't really going for it anyway, type of thing. I think she saw something in me that was perhaps a fear of failure. And go for it. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't matter. But to get, to really set a goal. I wasn't particularly good at setting myself goals.
Yeah.
I was quite happy to just go with the flow.
Right. Last question. What's the best piece of advice you've been given that you can pass on to our audience?
This is something, again, I still probably don't practice as much as I would preach, but that delegation is a gift and not a burden that you can give people. I think we hold back from delegating to busy people because we don't want to overload people. But actually it's the way of allowing them to step up and for them to grow. And I think it's in any leadership work I've done across the many sectors that Kianis works with and in my other work, it's the thing people struggle with most is delegation, because they fear that it looks like they're being lazy. And so I try to reframe it as a gift. And someone else taught me that.
Yeah.
So if you're delegating something, it's a gift that you're giving someone. It's an opportunity for them to shine.
For sure. And that's so easy for people to just think that they need to do it all. But you won't become a good leader, and you certainly won't develop good leaders unless you're giving them that opportunity to step up. Gill Wilkinson, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.